If you're following along in your bulletin, your schedule here, you'll see that Andres Martinez is the moderator of this panel. I am not Andres Martinez, unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know. But he's unable to be with us. My name is Eric Olson. I work with the Mexico Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I coordinate a joint project between the Mexico Institute and the Transborder Institute that looks at security cooperation. And so I am delighted to be able to fill in for Andres and welcome you and welcome our panelists to what I think will be a very fascinating discussion this morning. As you've heard already this morning, there are a number of important issues in U.S.-Mexican relations. The economy, of course, is of extreme paramount importance. There are issues related to energy and natural resources, migration, a whole plethora of very, very important issues. It so happens that right now the issue seems to be on the agenda, that of security and what both countries are doing to respond to a growing security threat and security problem in Mexico and in the United States. So we have assembled quite an impressive panel here to try to help us tackle this issue this morning. I'm going to introduce them, allow them to speak, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. We're going to start off with Professor John Bailey, who is professor at Georgetown University Department of Government. He's the director of the School of Foreign Services Mexico Project. His current project is Public Security and Democratic Governance in Mexico. He also is working with us at the Wilson Center at the Mexico Institute on our project and has contributed a great piece on the strategies that both governments are using to combat organized crime. So he will provide us, I think, with a very insightful overview of the issue at hand, which is the drug war and organized crime and violence in Mexico and the U.S. Next to me, next to Professor Bailey, and next on our panel is the newly appointed Commissioner for U.S. Customs and Border Protection, Alan Burson. He comes to that position with a wealth of experience on U.S.-Mexico issues. He was at one point, I believe, the U.S. Attorney in Southern California, correct? But most recently was the Assistant Secretary for International Affairs and Special Representative for the U.S.-Mexican border in the Department of Homeland Security, and we're just delighted to have him here. He brings together kind of the Wilsonian vision of academia and policy, because he has a real background in these issues and very knowledgeable about them. And last but not least, our co-host here, Tim Golden, who many of you know from his time as a senior writer at the New York Times and the New York Times Magazine, and currently is the Bernard L. Schwartz Senior Fellow at the New America Foundation. He will wrap it up and put this all in context and explain it all to us and make sense of it all. So thank you, Tim. So let me turn it over now to Professor Bailey.
Thank you. The question that was put to me for the panel was, it seems like corners are a metaphor today, and as Mexico turned a corner on the security front and the question of the war against cartels and what might ultimate success look like. I'm not going to talk about ultimate success, but I will deal with the metaphor of corners and what kind of corner this might be and what might be a kind of a path toward something like success and what might be a path toward something like failure, because corners have both positive directions and I think they may have negative directions as well. I've followed Mexico for 42 years, and the crime and violence is the worst that I've seen. And so the security issue is the top issue, and I'm glad that we're spending a good bit of time on it today. What might success look like? Let's take what I take to be the Mexican view of what success would look like with respect to organized crime and trafficking organization. And this is put by Attorney General Medina Morta, and it was put again today by Ambassador Sardu Khan. And that is that the security threat becomes a public security threat rather than a national security threat. And I take that for shorthand to mean a national security threat is one in which a group threatens the state's institutions, its basic institutions, including its army and its intelligence services and its courts and administration of law, and challenges the government for control over territory, and will confront the government and confront its security forces, including its army. And I think that's the shorthand of what is meant by a national security threat. And the trafficking organizations have become just that. That is, they've penetrated a number of security organizations, and they are confronting in ways that I find really very puzzling and frightening the state security forces, including the army. A public security threat, on the other hand, is one in which law enforcement and democratic institutions are threatened by some group. It's not as though territory is under threat. It's not as though the state's institutions are penetrated and threatened. But it is a kind of a threat to the maintenance of legality or the administration of public safety. So I take that view to be, well, success is moving from this more serious threat to one that's still a threat, but perhaps less the crime becomes more dispersed, less confrontational, less openly violent, and the metric that Ambassador Sardu Khan used was a decline in the violence. And we also heard, I thought, pretty straightforward, balloons can work for us, which is let's push this problem somewhere else. And I think by a metric of success, to the extent that trafficking can be moved out of Mexico and somewhere else, although it's not very clear to me where that's going to go. We talked a little bit about the Caribbean, but the metric of what is the road towards success is moving from a national security threat to a public security threat, and then pushing this trafficking elsewhere. The most important, to me, factor in the road towards success is the police, the federal police. If there's a game changer out here, if there's a cavalry on the way, I hope, it would be the federal police. And I would hope somebody who knows more about this than I do could tell me something about the formation of the Policía Federal to replace the old federal preventive police, because that seems to me to be the game changer. The notion of how long the Army will stay and when the lead role will be taken by the police depends on the quality of the police. And what's also critical in the road towards success is the timing of the changes of the institutions. If the police are prepared and take the field and do their job, then it's important that the justice system also evolve and be able to deal with what the new situation is. And it's important that the prison system also evolve, and it's important that the rehabilitation system also evolve, so that it's not as though we can talk about just the police. We need to have kind of a focus on the rhythm of change in a variety of institutions at the same time. And I'm frankly skeptical that the justice reform can, in some ways, keep. If I can be optimistic about police reform, I'm a bit skeptical that the justice reform will keep up. And so we'll find a kind of desfase, a kind of a misfit between the changes that take place in the police and the changes that might take place in the justice system. What's really important then is the police. Are they really getting prepared? Are they taking the field? What's also important is the intelligence system. Because if we're thinking about trafficking organizations, the critical factor here is where are they, who are they, where are their assets, what kinds of activities are they involved in, and can they be anticipated? Can their activities be anticipated? And that really depends on the quality of intelligence. And the game changer there would be the Mexicans are investing quite a lot in their intelligence system and trying to pair up, trying to harmonize their police intelligence with the formation of their new police. And the game changer also would be in cooperation with the United States, because it seems to me this is one of the most important areas, is in police cooperation and intelligence cooperation. If we're looking for a road towards success, down the road, let's look at the four pillars and the question that was raised earlier by our colleague David Shirk, which is the social development programs, the building of strong communities. I'm one of those who's a great believer in pilot projects, that we don't know what works. And so why don't we try a number of different things in a number of different places and see what works, and then try to build on those through diffusion in other parts of the country. And I think there's some policy learning. I'm also a great student of policy learning. If you keep trying something, eventually you learn something, and so you do it better. And I'm a believer that in the U.S. Merida policy, there's some learning taking place, and there's some effort now to do something which is a kind of a pilot, and in a couple of cities. And so this could also be an important game changer. If this works and shows the way toward the kind of preventive plus coercive plus other kinds of measures, then I think that's on the road towards success. So ultimate success, let's don't talk about ultimate success. Let's talk about a journey, a long journey, but what might be the pointers toward that? What's the road toward failure? Police reform fails. And by failing, the symptoms would be high-level corruption, or the inability to really take the field and do the job that's needed against well-armed groups and politically savvy and very violent groups. So that if we see the police reform and then the police reform doesn't work out, we've got a kind of an indicator here that things aren't going very well. Another indicator of failure is the trafficking organizations continue or increase their confrontation. And there, what I haven't seen, and I hope I never see, is the kind of Colombian scenario where the trafficking organizations turn to car bombings or turn to political kidnappings or target public officials in ways that raise the stakes. That's a kind of a road toward, I think, failure as well. Also a road toward failure is the proliferation into new forms of crime, which the groups are already doing, and the integration of the groups into the formal economy. Although I thought Tyler was a little more optimistic about that than I am. I got the short-term kind of pessimistic view of things. But the degree to which the groups then integrate themselves into the formal economy becomes, I think, another sign of failure. The real important part in terms of if there is failure is the success of the United States involvement. I think the United States is making an effort to become more fully involved in these issues, and if it can be successful, then that takes us down one road. But if there's failure, then that reinforces that even with the goodwill and the involvement of the United States, these issues aren't becoming any better. Then that strikes me as really a negative sign. Also, complications, these aren't necessarily on the road to failure, but complications we talked about a little bit earlier. If we see no progress at all on immigration reform, if we see very little progress on drug demand reduction, if we see very little progress on anti-weapons trafficking, these are all signs toward a road toward failure. So let me change the metaphor here a little bit from corners to Tarzan, which is there's a very serious issue of timing here that President Calderon and his government, the metaphor is a little complicated, but picture a swamp full of crocodiles. You grab the vine, which is the army, and you swing out over the swamp. And you expect the other vine to be there, which is the reformed police, the improved intelligence, and very robust U.S. involvement. And so it's all about timing. And if you're out there over the swamp and the other vine's not there, that's literally at the end of your rope. And so what I'm hoping is that the sequence that we're involved here would be successful. Because to continue the metaphor, and I'll let it go at this, if the vine doesn't work, you either drop somewhere in the swamp or you swing back to the other bank. And so that really suggests an accommodation with the organizations and a kind of a new reality, a kind of a new political reality, which the United States would then have to somehow come to terms with. So let's be optimistic that the vine will be there, and that when we're out over the swamp, we can grab the vine and continue across. And let's see what Alan Burson says about the vine.
I don't know if that was a good setup or not, Mr. Commissioner, but I guess the ball has been thrown in your direction. We've asked you to talk a bit about, from the U.S. Government's point of view, how the U.S. is approaching these issues. So any insights?
I thank Professor Bailey. I don't think I could manage a guttural Tarzan shriek, nor do I think one would be called for, although I think the analysis is correct. Let me put into perspective some of the directions that John has alluded to, with an indication of more of a historian's view than a political analyst's view, because in fact success failure really is something that in terms of the developments we're speaking of is going to be measured over decades with short-term milestones to be sure, but we're talking about a huge transformation. I've been known to say in academic settings that aside from what is happening in China and possibly India, Mexico is undergoing the most dramatic transformation that we've seen in recent times. And the nature of this transformation is very much part of the large-scale democratization project that has been underway for some time. And I would point Americans back to two developments that I think put into perspective what is happening in Mexico. 1957, the American public discovered that we had a mafia in the United States. Of course, the mafia had long existed, but it was only in 1957 that the New York Times published the picture of a series of organized crime figures, some with their hats over their faces, coming out of a mafia conference that was being held in Appalachia, New York. Appalachia then became the platform from which the United States mounted a 3-decade effort to deal with what was an extensive mafia organization that had infiltrated significant portions of local, in some cases county, and less frequently state political organizations. This was an effort that involved first the recognition, public recognition. Having grown up on the streets of Brooklyn, I sort of sensed that there was a mafia in the United States. But in fact, it was not officially recognized until Congress began holding hearings. In fact, legislation ultimately resulting in the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act was passed by Congress, and law enforcement, principally the FBI, but also state and local police, were given the tools and the resources that over the course of 25 years reduced the mafia from a public safety threat, in the sense in which Professor Bailey has addressed it, to a law enforcement problem that was relatively insignificant. Today, when my teenage daughters, a second round of children, think of the mafia, they first think of The Sopranos. Not a significant law enforcement threat, but not a public safety threat. Putting this next to the situation in Mexico, I think it's correct to say, to contrast the public safety threat or a law enforcement problem with a national security threat. However, I think we can overplay the national security threat, and those who would suggest that Mexico is facing the kind of challenge that that Colombia was facing, I think completely overstate the case. The potential, of course, is there, but I think a low probability event. Mexico, I even hesitate to use the term Mexico in the same context that Barry McCaffrey had used it a year ago in the terms of a threatened, a failed state. It's not close, not even relevant. But in fact, the lesson, I think, for our Mexican colleagues from our experience, although it will play out in the Mexican context according to the facts of Mexico and the desires of the Mexican people and Mexican leadership, is that this path of building an authentic judiciary and creating a reliable police department is the work of a generation, not a matter of 2 years or 5 years, but a generation. And I would also remind my American colleagues that we did have very corrupt police departments in the United States. As recently as 30 years ago, we have occasions of corruption now in places like Customs and Border Protection, of which I am aware, but it is not a systematic tainting of the political regime, which is what I think Mexico is taking on in the context of its police modernization efforts. So I think we need to look at this in historical terms, recognizing that there are short-term challenges. But those short-term challenges really do lead us to a situation where I think it can be said that el futuro ya no es lo que era. The future is not what it used to be, and that is a function of a dramatic policy change, signaled in the first instance by Merida, but one in which I think the Obama administration, the Calderon administration, have taken to the next level. It's an acknowledgement that the problems that we face bilaterally, principally at the border, whether it deal with drug trafficking and organized crime or illegal immigration or H1N1 virus threats, is that we have a co-responsibility for these issues. The causation is a function of developments in both countries rather than it being an occasion for finger pointing. And that has set the stage for, frankly, the most dramatic change that I've seen in my return from government with regard to border-related affairs and bilateral affairs, which is that the United States and Mexico have the intellectual basis for a policy coordination and a policy dialogue that simply was not present at any time since the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in the mid-19th century. There is the basis, because of shared understandings about what our problems are, for there to be mutually respectful dialogues in which issues of sovereignty, while still critical concerns, obviously, have given way to the understanding that we can binationally approach these issues because of the way we view them now. To use Thomas Kuhn's now somewhat hackneyed term, paradigm, indeed the paradigm has changed. The way in which we see the world is different, and that changes many of the dimensions of our interaction. In that respect, I want to pass on to you an observation that I heard from Jorge Castaneda in Mexico City, because I think a group like this will be able to learn from it as I did. As we go forward, the largest threat to this developing bilateralism, and in some cases binationalism, which is the next step in our TLC-NAFTA relationship, is that there's a real lag in the understanding of our publics and our political elites of what, in fact, is happening. And what Jorge pointed out, which is interesting, and I think needs to set the stage for activities of whether it's the New America institution or the Woodrow Wilson Center, is to begin the socialization of this new paradigm, of this new vision. And indeed, when it comes to Mexico, as Jorge Castaneda pointed out, the Mexican people, by and large, are ahead of its elites in terms of understanding where the future is. People have voted with their feet, they vote with their preferences, and it is actually the Mexican people who have outdistanced, and I say this respectfully to my friends, who have outdistanced those who grew up in the official reality of the United States and Mexico being somewhat uncomfortable with the bilateral relationship because of our history. For all of the friendliness of our border, we never really grasped this together and dealt with it together binationally. And the Mexican people are more comfortable with that than many of my academic friends and political leaders in Mexico. In the United States, we face precisely the opposite challenge, according to Senor Castaneda. And that is that the political and academic elites are intellectually comfortable with a bilateral engagement, and the American people are not. So what we have to do as we mount the convergence is to take the kinds of ideas that are being discussed here, take them out of the very restricted atmosphere in which they're discussed, and for people to start to socialize these notions. And lastly, I think the framework or the platform is set for dramatically changed ways of viewing old realities that in some ways academics are less capable of reacting to than others closer to the scene. So instead of looking at borders as juridical lines, and I'll take this as one example coming out of the high-level group meeting, that unprecedented voyage of the American Security Cabinet to Mexico a couple of weeks ago. One of the results, and only one, and I raise it only because it's of interest to me and I'm trying to think through the implications and solicit your help in doing so, is instead of looking at borders as juridical lines and simply as political boundaries on a map, to look at borders as the secure flows of people and passengers, cargo and things, so that we begin to look at a bilateral responsibility for not pushing all of our commercial relationship to the border where it is slowed down by a choke point, but rather see this bilateral relationship as permitting the securing of cargo and the clearing of passengers in time much before they arrive to that physical barrier, and in space way into the interior of both countries, and then securing the passage of people and passengers, cargo, and things. When you share a vision of the bilateral relationship that sees us as being mutually respectful and seeing national security threats to Mexico as being national security threats to the United States, there is a panorama of possibilities that never existed before. And I do think we're at a turning point in our relationship. But as the historians remind us, those who fail to turn at turning points actually experience discomfort and pain.
Sudden stop. Tim Golden, I'll turn it to you. You've been a long time student and observer of Mexico and U.S. relationship with Mexico. Help us understand this.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about the U.S. relationship in wrapping this up, but I guess I would start with an obvious caution, which is that I don't think we understand this underworld and its violence as well as we pretend to. Clearly, the government's push under Felipe Calderón has fueled some of the violence, but I think still there are signs and there are things that you can read in the day's news that indicate that the largest proportion of this violence is still kind of gang-on-gang violence, or gang-on-gang violence that involves the military and the police to the extent that they're participants in the trafficking business. And in that sense, it may be less like Colombia in the days of the Medellin cartel, where you had an open confrontation between Pablo Escobar and the state, than maybe the Russian mob violence of the early 1990s in the former Soviet Union. And the Russian example is maybe a hopeful one, because it suggests that these gangs are fighting for territory after a period in which big drug organizations have been broken up or disrupted, and that people in what is ultimately a business will be smart enough to understand that this level of violence is bad for business, and as the reaccommodation or restructuring happens, the violence will diminish. In terms of the traffickers' relationship to the Mexican state, I'm sure Carlos Slim or Televisa wouldn't appreciate the comparison, but I think you do have changes that are of a piece with the broader shifts of power in Mexico since 2000. This is a major economic entity that was in some sense in partnership with the state, in monopoly partnership with the state, and that relationship has broken up after the fall of the PRI, and we're seeing some of the consequences. But already I think Mexico's drug problem is less about the flow of drugs, or Mexico and the United States. I would say the drug problem in Mexico is less about the flow of drugs into the United States and through Mexico than it is about the consolidation of organized crime and the deterioration of the criminal justice system in Mexico, with huge implications for both countries that are coming into focus now, but have been in the offing certainly since the early 1990s. In parts of Mexico where organized crime is strong, it's harder and harder to get justice for any crime. That means if your car is stolen or your house is broken into or someone in your family is assaulted, you have to pay more to the corrupt police. It's harder to get their attention. It's much harder to you feel the reverberations of this throughout Mexican society. And I think you already see some distortion of politics, not as much as some people might expect, but the places like Baja California and Chihuahua State that were laboratories of democracy, that were among the first places where the opposition came into power, are now leaders of disenchantment and have been since the early 2000s. The campaign of Jorge Jankron in Baja California, although it was not successful, is maybe an indication of this. The possible renewal of support for authoritarian government throughout Mexico. And I don't think there's a Plan Colombia that solves this. I absolutely take Alan Burston's point that there's a greater basis for cooperation between Mexico and the United States now than there probably ever has been, both because of the depoliticization of the security relationship and because of the need, maybe also just the maturation of the relationship. But the United States' focus on drug trafficking in Mexico, I think, is largely still where it has been, which is the flow of drugs. People could argue that the United States was able to more or less end the drug war when the war on terrorism supplanted it. And we diverted huge amounts of intelligence and security resources away from the drug problem in Mexico without any kind of public outcry to speak of in this country. But obviously we haven't done a lot of learning about the solutions in the meantime, and anyone who is optimistic about our ability to build police institutions hasn't been paying much attention to Iraq and Afghanistan. Overseas, I think SMS messaging and some of the things that the ambassador talked about might help, but obviously it's entirely at the margins. I got to know Alan Burston a little bit in the early 1990s when he was up to his elbows in the Arellano Felix organization, and one of the very few successful efforts that the United States has made to fight a major drug trafficking organization across its borders. But I don't think I think it's a lot harder for us, and we have been far less successful at the efforts that have gone along since that time in terms of building Mexican police capacity beyond, I think, that the same formula that we've used, vetted teams, intelligence capabilities, some sharing of information, and then basic things like handcuffs and guns and surveillance equipment. So I think that's the place where the focus really needs to shift. We had to figure out in this more complicated arena of a Mexican police system that John Bailey is absolutely right in putting front and center. How do we do this, and how do the two countries do it together? Because the idea of cooperation may be much more palatable now, but when you get into the nitty-gritty of a culture of corruption in the police and people that you make alliances with that then betray you, it gets harder fast. So I'll throw all that out there. I don't think I've wrapped up anything necessarily, but maybe it's grist for thought.
We're doing well on time here, so I'm going to give the panelists an opportunity, if they wish, to respond to each other or raise any issues. I had a couple questions that I wanted to throw out, and I promised that we will get to the dialogue with you all as well. John Bailey, I guess a couple questions come to mind too on your what was it, the Tarzan scenario. I don't want to take it too far, but two things come to mind. One is the image of a vine is one of a pendulum that goes out and could come back. And I guess, what Ambassador Sarkhan was saying this morning is there's no going back. We're not going to go back to some kind of a negotiated accommodation with this is all forward. We may learn along the way, but there's no going back. I mean, do you share that sense that there's really no turning back here, that this is not going to revert to some sort of negotiated accommodation between them? And then the second question there, you mentioned the importance of the police, obviously extremely important, intelligence, what the U.S. role. What I didn't hear was really so much about the importance of the judicial system. You mentioned it, but it wasn't. That strikes me as that being a key element here, and I don't know. Commissioner Burson, I mean, I'm just the one we've talked about these four pillars. The issue of the 21st century border. It sounds great, but I at the end of the day, I don't know what it means exactly pragmatically. Are we talking about really investing in whole new kinds of infrastructure along the way? What does that mean from your perspective? I don't know if there are other questions that you want to pose to each other or respond to some of this before we open it up here in about 5 minutes.
Good, thanks. I'm a great fan of Denise Dresser, and she uses these outrageous metaphors, and I never can remember what her point was, but I always remember the metaphors. So I've decided that's how you do public talks, is you use these metaphors. Now they'll not remember what he said, but the metaphor will be there. I think the vine, can swing back, and that is what interests me about looking at it as an analyst, what interests me about the Mexican case is the confrontation has gone on much, much longer than it ought to have gone on. And Tim mentioned the Russian case, and in the Russian case, the groups confronted each other, but the period of confrontation was not more than a couple of years. And in that case, the power ministries reasserted themselves. The intelligence services and the old armed forces reasserted themselves, and the state was somehow able to recompose itself. The Mexican violence has gone on much longer than it ought to have gone on. And I don't have a good explanation for why that is, except for surpluses of violent entrepreneurs and surpluses of weapons and competition among groups for internal markets and for these other markets. But studying Colombia or looking at the other countries in the region, the Mexican case now has gone on for 6 years or so, 5 or 6 years, and that's really at levels that seem to be still accelerating. I'm one of those who thinks that really the normal relationship between organized crime and the state is evasion and corruption. That states work out their own sort of equilibrium, and the equilibrium involves, in some ways, a strong state. The option for the organized crime groups is evasion, and then minor forms of corruption, which you've mentioned. There are, even in strong societies, there are points of corruption that organized criminal groups can take advantage of. And in the Mexican case, when the vine swings back, if it does swing back, we'd expect to see, unless there is some very strong institutional development, very strong performance on the part of the police justice system, we'd expect to see the return to corruption. And that is a decline in violence and an accommodation, if that is the way that it happens. And then what that would look like, I don't know, but it would be an accommodation if we take into account Luis Rubio's reflection this morning about the way in which the presidency has evolved itself into a feudalism. Then we'd expect to see the patterns of corruption to be decentralized and to be aimed more at the state and local level, but virtually across the party system. The emphasis, why not talk more about the justice system? I'm not convinced that reforming the justice system will have an effect on crime. That we can look at justice reform in a number of countries, and those countries that have made some progress, it's not necessarily the change in the criminal codes that have reduced the crime, but it's the interaction between the police, justice, penitentiary, rehabilitation system that may have some influence on crime. And I'm a student of this, and I never can understand terribly well why crime does what it does. It seems to just behave in its own ways, that one can improve the justice system and crime will go up. One can leave the justice system alone and crime will go down. And so trying to relate these together, I'm not convinced that it is. I do think the justice system and the attention to the accusatory model is very important for transparency and for confidence building. The extent to which the citizenry can see how justice evolves and can see the processes more openly, I think is very healthy for the system. But to expect justice reform to have an effect on crime, I would hope that it does, but I'm not convinced that it does across countries.
Let me turn quickly to the border, but simply note, John, it's always refreshing to hear a political scientist concede that sometimes the cause and effect is beyond the tools of analysis we have. But I think the critical importance of both the police reform effort and the judicial effort is this notion of legitimacy. Legitimacy requires that people accept the new order of society, and without that legitimacy, it will be hard to sustain this effort over any acceptable stretch. The broken window theory of law enforcement actually has some application here. What we discovered when we had epidemics of violence in our cities in the late 80s and 90s as a function of the crack cocaine epidemic that we suffered during those years was that neighborhoods would degenerate very quickly as epidemics can decimate a population. But that with proper measures you can actually reverse the epidemic as quickly as you can reach the reverse tipping point as quickly as the tipping point was reached in the first instance. And in many ways, what we learned in the broken window theory of law enforcement was that you have to pay attention to lawfulness very much at the street level, at the retail level, and that when you do, you fix the broken windows, you penalize littering, you penalize minor infractions. So, for example, in Juarez, just parenthetically, 30% of the cars traveling around the city of Juarez have no license plates. You set a tone for a society and you build a culture. That was very much the way in which American cities were reclaimed in parts of Detroit and parts of New York City, and it, I think, has some application here to the issues we've discussed. On the 21st century border, I want you to imagine a world in which passengers are pre-cleared and vetted in the interior of Mexico and come into the United States as we welcome passengers from the Netherlands. I want you to imagine a parts manufacturing company in Indiana having a secure flow north and south, or a manufacturer in Guadalajara filling a truck container, having that pre-cleared through X-rays, which are being read in Virginia, then are secured with a new generation of ionic seals, and then travel up to the border and don't stop at Laredo, but have a complete path into the United States as we work past drayage to much more sophisticated issues of secure manufacturing zones. The notion that security and commerce need to be balanced, which is the traditional way that we've looked at these issues at the border, needs to be supplanted by an integration of these concepts. That in fact, rather than attempting to find the threat by plucking a needle out of the haystack, we need to blow the hay of trusted travelers and trusted cargoes away so that we can spend our time at the physical border on those people and those things about which we know little. Just a tempting peek into what the 21st century border can hold.
Tim, is there anything else you want to add before we open it up?
Well, maybe just that I think you can you can probably try to rebuild the Mexican criminal justice system from the ground up in some ways, but I'm a little skeptical about the community policing model. I, for one, still see the ghost of Rudy Giuliani floating over Mexico City with millions of Carlos Slim's dollars that I'm not sure what they went for. Those experiences obviously don't contemplate the deficiencies on the police side and the culture of corruption that you're dealing with in Mexico. And I think in some senses, and people obviously get this part of it, the disconnect between the criminals and the drug organizations that don't and the civil society that doesn't necessarily see itself as a primary victim, even as it's feeling the effects more and more. So.
Great. Well, we have a good bit of time for questions, for dialogue. I see a number of hands. Why don't we take 3 questions, and then we'll see where we are. We have revolving mics. We have somebody here.
Hi, Robert Schroeder. For Mr. Burson in particular, Homeland Security, the vision for the future that you just described would require, I believe, people to identify themselves as they're coming across that border. This is a very real problem, as you know, and I guess the next panel will address it more, but there's an awful lot of people in Texas and Arizona becoming increasingly concerned about the crime problem now entering the U.S. So would you look for an infrastructure that would allow for people to at least somehow identify themselves?
Absolutely. That's the basis for the integration of security and the expediting of lawful traffic. This is about insisting on that relationship and maintaining a very strong presence at the physical checkpoint, at the physical border, for those whom we know little about or nothing about. So this is not about waiving indiscriminately, but it's about offering opportunities. In fact, a grand bargain in our American civil liberties context, a grand bargain in which we rightfully have long traditions of not wanting to share information with the government, and I respect those rights. However, the grand bargain is that if you share information about who you are and what your antecedents are and what your intentions are, there are 2 reciprocal advantages you gain. One is a pledge that information will not be misused, and the second is that you will be expedited in your movement across heretofore less than permeable barriers.
We had a question here, right up here, and then 2 more in the back. So why don't you go ahead? Oh, Professor Grayson, I couldn't see you.
George Grayson from the College of William and Mary, and I would first recommend that the new America Foundation ban all metaphors in the future. A quick comment and then a quicker question. There is the idea that we are going to somehow reform a police force that is broken. What we have to remember in Mexico is there's never been honest law enforcement. I mean, the DFS under Don Fernando was crooked and corrupt on purpose. The judicial police were just as bad, if not worse. And so the challenge isn't trying to remake a police force that was once a lean, clean law enforcement machine. We're starting from scratch. And the question is that earlier this year, General Garcia Ochoa, a 40-year veteran of the Army, in fact, he was the private secretary of General Cervantes, whom I'm sure Tim remembers, wrote a monograph. And the monograph had quite limited circulation, but in that monograph, he expressed the great reservations that the Army has about its current role, about its being pelted for human rights abuses, the failure of the politicians to immunize it by passing legislation related to Article 121, and the concern that after the Calderon administration leaves office, that human rights organizations may go to international tribunals and accuse zonal and regional commanders of war crimes. I mean, do you have any sense for how SecDef is, what's going on in SecDef with regard to its attitude toward its role in the drug war?
You want to take one or two questions? Right, turn right behind you there. There's a couple more people.
Thank you. I'm Aaron Houston with the Marijuana Policy Project, and Commissioner Burson, particularly for you, the cartels get 70% of their profits from marijuana sales alone. It seems like the elephant in the room that if we were to cut off if we were to reform our current drug laws, that we would actually cut them off and devastate them if we were to allow, for example, United States citizens to grow it themselves. This is the elephant in the room. Senor Castaneda has said that we should do this to bankrupt the cartels. I'm curious about your thoughts on that and when the Obama administration is going to start acknowledging that elephant in the room that many other people seem to be acknowledging. And also, separately, sir, I'd be curious, there was a very disturbing Senate hearing 2 weeks ago on potential cartel moles by Senator Pryor. Noted that Mr. Tomaszek from your office noted that of the 10%, mere 10% that you guys were able to polygraph for potential organized crime connections, 60% of them were disqualified. And I was wondering if you guys have had a chance to think about what kind of plan you're going to do to address that.
Great. One more question right behind there.
David Shirk, I'm a fellow at the Wilson Center, and if George Grayson can double dip, I'm going to do the same. Last century, I remember we talked about borders as sort of fading away, and it seems to me that a 21st century border would perhaps look more like Europe, where everybody's pre-cleared within the Schengen zone, and we can cross from one border to the other relatively easily. What are the prospects for thinking long-term for a North American model that looks more like Europe and less like a fortified border arrangement like we have now?
We'll do one more round of questions after we give our panelists an opportunity to respond to some of these. Anyone want to respond to Professor?
History of law enforcement?
History of law enforcement.
Without metaphors, no metaphors. I'm not so pessimistic as George about police reform, and I take Alan Burson's point about the significance of legitimacy. The use of the police 70 years under the PRI was an exchange of police served the political leadership in exchange for impunity. And I'm not so pessimistic that in the transition toward a democratic system that a new basis of legitimacy can be at least attempted. And so if there is some success in moving forward with building institutions, then the basis for a modern police, could be as stronger than was the case in the past. The incentive was built in the pre-system, as you know very well, that the exchange was very, very strong. Impunity in exchange for political service to the regime. And I would hope over the longer term that basis could be changed. The other is to introduce an idea of which George, you've written about this as well. Talking about the Army as one thing and the police as another is a little artificial. And Grayson's written books on the number of Army officers who've migrated to the police and the ways in which the Army has transformed itself over the last 6 or 7 years in its organization and its acquisitions and in the way in which it deploys itself to look more like an internal gendarmerie. So the two institutions are overlapping in some ways. There could be discontent in the Army, and there could be some issues that are there. But I think the Army in 2010, the Mexican Army in 2010, looks different from the Army in 2000. And so the issues that you raise about vulnerabilities and so forth could be out there, and it could be creating tensions within the Army. But I have one anecdote, not a metaphor. Interview with a high-level Army person, and I was raising the same question. Well, when do you think the Army can stand down so that the police could stand up? And I was just sort of waiting to see what his answer was, and the commander said, well, I don't know, what do you think? I said, well, your president says it's going to be in 2012. The Army will stand down and the police will stand up. And he looked at me like this idiot, and he said, well, 2012, the president moves on. We're still here.
So I'm hoping the transition takes place, but the two institutions are beginning to look more like each other.
Commissioner Burson?
Yeah. Let me address the legalization issue in two ways, because I think it's a fair question, but it will come as no surprise that I don't think that the answer to either organized crime or public health lay in this direction. The first is that yes, in fact, marijuana is the largest cash crop on which the cartels rely for in a business revenue generating sense right now. But the fact is that the legalization of marijuana would not lead to the disappearance of organized crime in Mexico, because in fact we're already beginning to see the branching out to other activities, and that's been the history of organized crime, whether in Sicily or in Boston. So I don't see the approach as producing a decisive blow to organized crime. And the second dimension of the issue, I would offer the analogy of again, a generation-long lesson. In fact, in this case, even more than a generation, was the dealing with tobacco and the way in which tobacco was studied, analyzed, presented, discussed, debated at a whole variety of levels in American society. And I do not think there is a shortcut if, in fact, at some point in the future, which I would not favor, this decision is made to legalize it. It will be on the basis of a lot more evidence than exists now for the proposition that, we should legalize marijuana simply because it will deal with organized crime. I think, for the reasons I've indicated, that's not the path that we ought to follow. But I also think there's a fair amount of public health work that needs to be done before this proposition is seriously considered.
Would you be willing to comment on this question of David Shirk's about, one thing is the 21st century border, the other is this kind of European notion of broader borders out,
My colleague from San Diego will appreciate if I reach back to something I read many, many years ago. It was a novel called The Floating Opera by John Barth. And in there, Barth has a terrific line. He says, Italy could have been shaped as much like a sausage as a boot, but it happened to be shaped like a boot. Sometimes what the world is not a matter of logic, but an issue of what the case is. So I would say that, yes, I think it's a useful historical analogy, but Mexico and the United States and Canada are going to have to evolve its own path to looking at North America as a economic space and a security perimeter.
Tim, did you want to add anything here?
I would just throw in a couple points of emphasis. I'm always amused when mostly journalists give precise numbers for the flow of drugs into the United States or anywhere else for that matter. I think those are largely fictitious. I don't think we really know. And I think what's relevant here is that you do have semi-verifiable numbers that indicate that the pie for Mexican drug traffickers seems to be shrinking over time, particularly in terms of cocaine. Price is going down, yet purity is going up, and the impact of that is in the diversification of organized crime groups in Mexico, which may also be one of the elements of the violence that we haven't really talked about. There was an incredible study by the leading Mexican human rights organization about kidnapping, sort of short-term kidnappings of migrants coming through the country, and they were talking about millions of thousands and thousands of cases and the amount of money that this generates. I don't think anybody knows, but it certainly shows you that the expansion of these groups and their tentacles is a far bigger problem than just the drug trade.
Okay, we have time for two more questions. I'm going to start here with Diana Negroponte.
Diana Negroponte from the Brookings Institution. My question is directed to Tim Golden, but it also implies a response, please, from Alan Burson. Tim, you talked about the Russian gangs in their inter-gang violence, and I think that has been, over the last 2 years, the assumption that we've made about the Mexican cartels. But on Good Friday, the coordinated attack in Reynosa against army garrisons and against police patrols suggests that this is more akin to Peshawar than it is to Moscow, and that we do have a direct attempt to weaken the state and to persuade the Mexican public that the state cannot keep them safe. Now, I give that word insurgency. And we don't have any Mexican officials who can't use that word in public. But it looks like a duck, and it quacks like a duck. And that implies that we have to think of counterinsurgency tactics to meet this. And the implication for Commissioner Burson is, Commissioner, you have sought to dismiss perhaps the national security threat, but if what I've described is occurring, aren't we really looking at national security? Thank you.
Let's see. We'll take one more question here on the far side, on the outside here.
Hi, good morning. Eric Guillen from Washington Center student and National Defense University intern. We were talking about a lot of the problems with the police system in general in Mexico, but also one of the biggest problems is the timing of reactions from the federal government and the local states. The question is time or the local states are ready to having, for instance, international relationships with another international bodies in order to build a bridge for help, or we must wait for the federal help? And remind that the federal help is only the army presence. It's only because of the weapons. They still don't know how to act like a police. So that's the question.
Okay, Tim?
Well, I don't think I've ever felt like Donald Rumsfeld or Paul Wolfowitz before, but the insurgency question is not one it's not that I think it's wrong or that you can't say it. I just think that there's a mix of things going on, and maybe I glossed over this a little bit too quickly, but I think that what the violence against police and against the army up until this point has been largely, or up until the last few years, I think was largely targeted because targeting the violence was effective on the part of the traffickers. They went after, if there was one police commander or military commander who represented a problem, you could get the message across and eliminate the problem by killing that person. That now seems to be harder to do. So perhaps they're directing themselves they're directing their fire in a wider way. But I think the other element of this is that you have a culture, and maybe this is the part of the relevance of the Afghan or Pakistan or Iraq example is you start to have almost a culture of terrorism and the violence that may go back to episodes that happened among these guys in the late 1980s. Somebody's head got chopped off and somebody's children were killed. But now is obviously widened much more. The place that I think that metaphor, and George, it was a good idea, but it will never work to ban the metaphors. But where that metaphor of insurgency doesn't help us necessarily, I suppose, is in the solutions. Because I think if we could send drones, if Mexico wanted drones, they'd have them. And if that were a good way to get at this, we would do it. But in some ways, I think the problem is the overemphasis on the kind of big ticket military solutions. even though they may be part of what has to be done.
Generally in accord with Tim's view. Let me say I think we're dealing with a national security issue. I think the president's been clear on that, as obviously President Calderon has been. And long term, the health and the security of the Mexican society and state are as important to the United States as perhaps any other matter. But with regard, and I think I agree with Tim that it's not an unreasonable observation, except there are very significant differences between what's going on